Second Binocular Symposium was held in 2 years ago, in March 2029, at the Royal Flemish Academy for Science and Arts in Brussels. The spot where we were supposed to meet each other in persona, but due to pandemic epoch, as you know, we had to postpone also several planned meetings. That meeting in the Royal Academy was supported by the Flemish European Conference, by the Flemish Conference, and by the Research Foundation of Flanders. We need binoculars to explore scenarios for the future. We need binoculars to detect, articulate the role of science, drafting those scenarios. I'm a comparativist. I'm fascinated by comparative law and policy. So throughout Europe, there are best and good examples, practices on innovative knowledge institutes that deliver a groundbreaking and inspiring thinking for foresight policies. The question is, whatever our status or our mission in life, what kind of society do you want for our grandkids and the kids of our grandkids for the future? Are we good ancestors? And how to deal with the tyranny of the moment.
Goedemorgen, spreek met Corine Prins. Ik ben bij de conferentie. Ik moet straks iets zeggen.
Transition from a sustainable development to a sustainable future. The more precarious the predictability of the future, the more pressing the need for knowledge about developments and the impact of future scenario and options become. Ik hoor nu de geluiden in de regiekamer. Kan u die afsluiten alstublieft? The future is VUCA. The future is volatile, uncertain, complex and ambiguous. Exploring the future instead of predicting the future. Daring to think about the future. So, should scientists be recognized as a guide, or are they seen as a troublemaker? COVID-19 definitely made a difference. Statements from political leadership from the last months, last year, during the pandemic times, is focusing on we follow science. We read the statistics, and decisions should be made on evidence-based research. Designing a future perspective should be a binding sign between politics and academia. After all, scientists and politicians share the same social mission. Although, of course, they are independent and they follow their own mission and deontology, but on shaping at the international, the European, the regional, the national and the local level, we need evidence-based foresight scenarios. The question raised is if scientists are convinced to take a long-term approach into account. And of course, there are differences between academics and politicians, and in some writings I try to define those criteria. But the care for the future requires a holistic approach, far away from the familiar silos. Research often focuses on a single core domain, where public policy by definition embraces several concerns at the same time. So this European conference precedes the second Flemish Binocular Symposium. And we definitely do hope to learn from the best practices Europe-wide. The Dutch model is seen as one of the most prominent models on foresight policies. And it's a privilege to co-chair this meeting, this conference with Professor Corinne Prins, who is the president of the Dutch Scientific Council for Government Policy. She is now on our screen. Corinne, thank you for having us. You have immediately the floor.
Dear Jan, did you give the floor to me? Yeah, because I could not hear you thus far. I've tried to arrange with the technicalities. I could not hear you, but can you hear me? Yeah? Okay. Then I'm sorry that I didn't quite get what you just presented in your introduction. But behalf on the Dutch Scientific Council for Government Policy, we're highly pleased that you and your colleagues organize this event. And unfortunately, we are not able to attend. I brought myself a binocular. I don't know whether you can see it, but this gives me the opportunity to be a bit close. Thank you very much for organizing the event, because in particular in these difficult and challenging times, I think it is crucial to look ahead. Long-term policy advice is crucial in these times, based on academic and scientific knowledge. What does that mean for policy advice? And I'm very much looking forward to what our colleagues will bring to the floor in our discussion, both this morning as well as later on this afternoon. So thank you for giving me the floor, giving the WRR the opportunity to reflect on some of the lessons that we've learned during our almost 50 years existence. And I will be touching on that shortly. Thank you, Professor de Groof.
Dear colleague Corinne, thank you so much being with us and taking the co-lead of this. Do you hear me right now? I guess you do. So, preparing this symposium, we in June last year, we invited the commissioner for interinstitutional relations and foresight, Maros Šefčovič, and he agreed to be with us last year. Unfortunately, he's not just commissioner between brackets, but he's also vice president and in charge of the Brexit negotiations, or the after Brexit negotiations after Michel Barnier. So he had to excuse himself. I prepared a short reference to one of the leading European Commission reports on the essential contribution of research for democracy. But we are following a strict script who is really detailed minute per minute. So I will refer to it next time. And may we invite the Director General of the Joint Research Center of the European Commission. The Commissioner delegated all this power, between brackets, on foresight policy for this meeting. And we are extremely happy to have Stephen Quest with us. Stephen is quite interesting, British and French. That can be intriguing, but very interesting indeed. He has a long record as a European bureaucrat, dealing with several DGs, and now leading the think tank on foresight policy. Stephen, you have immediately the floor.
Representing the Vice President, and to share with you a few thoughts about how we embed strategic foresight into the European Commission's work. The Joint Research Centre of the European Commission has long been active in supporting strategic long-term thinking of the Commission with Foresight. And I'd like to really just share today three things about this work, in a sense, sharing some of our binoculars with you today. It's a pleasure to do this. The first is to just sketch out some of the preliminary findings from our annual strategic foresight report, which we're planning to publish in July. So it's a bit of a heads up for you, and that the focus this year is on open strategic autonomy. After that, I'll talk a little bit about some of our megatrends tools, and then finally, a couple of words about how we work with national governments on future thinking and on foresight tools. But it's clear that strategic foresight really has a very firm place in European Union and national policy making, and I think this makes a lot of sense. Citizens expect our policies to create long-term benefits, and so government analysis necessarily relies on projecting the impact of policies into the future. But in doing this, we know that we face and struggle with some tensions, because we're under pressure to act now and to deliver things now, while at the same time we have to look ahead, and these things are not always compatible. We have to navigate between sometimes quite narrow policy priorities, while at the same time taking this more holistic view that you mentioned, Professor, in your introduction. And of course, we have to sometimes struggle a bit with the natural conservatism of bureaucracy, and at the same time the need often to think anew and act anew in these very challenging times. Now, foresight doesn't give you the silver bullet solution to all of this, but I think it can help in navigating tensions. And as you've said, in the Commission, certainly foresight is on the map, because President von der Leyen gave Vice President Šefčovič a very clear mandate. I think it's the first time ever a member of the college has a specific mandate to promote the use of foresight in policy making, and we're delighted in the JRC to be able to support him in this work. Now, one of the ways we do this is through the annual strategic foresight report that the Commission produces. The theme of this year's report, open strategic autonomy. I'll say a few words on this. What the crisis that we're going through has highlighted is that we have certainly many dependencies in Europe, and there's been a lot of discussion over the last year and a half about strategic autonomy, technological sovereignty, and we've seen this already echoed in some initiatives coming from the Commission. We saw the trade policy review recently, and even more recently, a new industrial strategy for Europe, where we've gone into quite some detail already in analyzing strategic dependencies, and in looking at capacities in a number of technological and industrial strategic areas. Now, foresight seeks to complement this work and add value to it, in part by giving a more forward-looking perspective. So we're looking up to 2040, and in part by also bringing in a multidisciplinary approach. Now, of course, we're not the only ones to be looking in this area. You'll probably all have seen the recent US National Intelligence Council Global Trends report. That sets a very big picture, key trends and drivers to 2040, climate change, volatile global governance, decreasing faith in institutions, very worrying for us, increase in misinformation, divisions in society, inequalities in income and information. So some really big themes highlighted there. What we are doing in the Open Strategic Autonomy report is to be a bit more specific and to try and build slightly more pragmatic links into EU policies. I'll just give you a few highlights as an avant-premiere of this work. One thing we'll do is to look at existing capacities, existing capabilities and vulnerabilities, and then map those against future opportunities and challenges. Now, in terms of vulnerabilities and challenges, the trends up to 2040 indicate quite a lot of turbulence. We are seeing probably unprecedented global change and instability. We're seeing a lot of demographic and social change. We're seeing ongoing significant technological advances and a growing incidence of systemic crisis. So quite a challenging period ahead. Change also seen coming up in the geopolitical front with an increasing redistribution of global power and major shifts expected towards a more multipolar and a more contested international order. And perhaps the emergence and positioning of global powers, particularly coming from the East. The energy transition as well will contribute to a redistribution of power globally. Now, on the other side, we also in the report will look at a number of opportunities because we think that our strategic autonomy is set to benefit from the acceleration that we're seeing in the green transition, where we're quite well positioned. We think the energy transition could also help reduce import dependency on fossil fuels. And we think that the circular economy could reduce needs to import some critical raw materials. And we're also highlighting the need for targeted investments in some areas like digital, artificial intelligence, cloud technologies, blockchain, and so on, in order to ensure that the required range of public services can still be made available to all citizens. The response to the pandemic demonstrates that multilateral cooperation is more effective than nationalisms, or vaccine nationalism, if you like. So we need to reinforce the EU's competencies in health in order to help mitigate the impact for health systems and the economy of aging populations and chronic diseases. And we see quite a lot of progress in the health sphere at the moment at European level. Now, the report will also look at 4 Foresight scenarios that the JRC team have developed on the future standing of the EU in 2040. Now, these are not predictions, but they are designed to be plausible 2040 futures, which help us to question our assumptions about both the present and the future. And by combining current evidence with the exploration of possible future developments, we then look to explore possible implications and priorities which might flow from these scenarios, and we map them across different dimensions of open strategic autonomy. And we've identified 5 of those dimensions: the geopolitical, the economic, technological, social, and environmental. So quite a broad span. And just to give a couple of examples, in geopolitics, we see the landscape evolving with developing countries starting to shift from being policy takers to being policy shapers. We see the economic weight of these countries, you can call them the emerging 7, projected to increase significantly by 2030 and starting to exert more influence on global economy and global rule setting. So one key decider for us is going to be what will be the combination of alliances that will emerge, the economic alliances, technological alliances, geopolitical alliances between the G7 and the E7. So that's one theme we see emerging. On technology, we highlight the importance of standard setting as a key factor for our strategic autonomy. We think the EU needs to use its regulatory and its soft powers to steer progress towards global standards that well reflect EU values and interests, because there's a race going on to get first mover advantage in standard setting, and the competition is especially relevant in new areas: artificial intelligence, quantum computing, green hydrogen, batteries, chemicals, and so on, where first mover advantage can really benefit companies and technologies. And a final example is on climate and environment, where we have in the EU the most ambitious legislation on climate action in the world, but our greenhouse emissions only account for 9% of the global total. So we're not going to win the fight on our own. We have to have a global green diplomacy as a new type of smart global policy. And just one example there is the work that's going on the carbon border adjustment mechanism, for example, to avoid the effectiveness of our EU climate policies being undermined by carbon leakage. Now, I'm going to move now to the second point, more briefly, the megatrends hub that we have in the JRC, because Foresight offers a variety of tools to look at the future, and the megatrends analysis helps us to look at the big trends and adjust our actions accordingly. Now, you probably know that when we make proposals for legislation in the Commission, we do an impact assessment, we look at the problem, and then we do a description of how the solution is going to resolve these problems. And in doing that, we look at trends, but probably in a rather limited way. And what we see is, since the world doesn't work in neat silos, we need to have a more holistic look at these megatrends. And in our competence center on Foresight in the JRC, we have a set of 14 megatrends. You can Google them. It's the Megatrends Hub, and you can find it on the web. And we are encouraging policymakers to look at them all as they're making their policy proposals, because what we see is policymakers tend to underestimate the impact of some megatrends. For example, the growing role of cities or new governance systems. Yet when they actually get to explore in workshops the interactions and interlinkages between these trends, it becomes clearer that they have a greater influence than expected, and that the trends which were initially thought to be less relevant can gain importance when you imagine them as a possible wildcard or a possible disruptive factor. And if you do this, it helps you then to build in the resilience of potential policy solutions from the beginning, rather than having to respond and react downstream, which is obviously a less effective way of working. So in the last year's strategic foresight report, which was on resilience, we actually started to look and see which of our megatrends have accelerated and which have decelerated due to the pandemic, because obviously they shift in time. We saw last year that the pandemic was deepening inequalities. It was accelerating the hyperconnectivity trend. It was contributing to the growing trend of shrinking population. And it was boosting the ongoing diversification of education and learning. But we also saw that some trends were being mitigated. For example, the growing influence of the East and the South, or increasing consumerism and urbanization were slowing down. Now, I'm going to wind up now by talking about the links with national government, because it's clear that strategic foresight capacity is needed not only at European but also national, and I would also say even regional and local level, to support and promote this. In last year's strategic foresight report, Vice President Šefčovič launched the initiative of having a ministerial level EU foresight network. He calls it the Ministers for the Future, and he wanted to bring together intelligence and foresight from the member states. I'm happy to report that the very first meeting of this network was held last week in Portugal under the Portuguese presidency, and it will meet now once a year to discuss strategic foresight priorities. And it'll be supported by a network of senior officials from national administrations, Sherpas for the ministers, who will meet more frequently and oversee and follow up and prepare next steps. So we have in the Commission very high hopes for this network and the sharing of collective intelligence amongst member states, which is now starting to accelerate thanks to the initiative of the Vice President. So in conclusion, strategic foresight, we believe, is an invaluable, vital contributor to our efforts to develop robust and resilient policies. It helps to manage uncertainty and complexity. It builds the capacity to anticipate change and to revisit policies in a hopefully more agile and responsive manner. And I hope that this very quick overview of the Commission's work on strategic autonomy has been useful. And I wish you all a very inspiring discussion for the rest of the morning. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Mr. Director General, for your bright keynote. An excellent example of how inspiring the multi-level approaches can be. We need more, let me be very frank. We need more Europe. European dimension of foresight policies will be definitely crucial and vital for the next decades. Let me move quickly now to the next part of our conference, namely best practices, good practices, best practices, Europe-wide. It's not that evident, not quite simple to make that selection. We followed some objective criteria on ranking those institutes, and one of the most powerful, as I mentioned already earlier, is the Dutch Council, Netherlands Scientific Council for Government Policy, headed by our colleague who took already the floor as a co-chair this earlier in earlier session. Professor Corinne Prins is professor of law, professor of computer law, long-standing credentials within the university, with huge number of publications and highly appreciated prizes. Corinne Prins was the first woman to hold the position of chair at the Dutch Council. We are really impressed by your commitment to the VRR, and please, Corinne, take the floor.
Thank you, Professor de Groof. Thank you very much for your kind words, and again for the opportunity to share a few lessons with you. And I have to admit that it is a bit difficult to do this by means of online facilities and not being there to share with you the thoughts and the lessons learned thus far by the VAR. I have a PowerPoint presentation and I hope that the technical facilities can put them up because I don't see them yet on my screen. But let me just start because I can also share with you the reflections without a PowerPoint, and that they will be distributed to you later on. First, a few general observations as regards the council. Here's the first image. That's our building, and I don't share the image for the very fact of the building, but to mention a first lesson, because Foresight is also about learning lessons from the past, learning lessons from our work in the past. This is our building, a very beautiful building, of course, and it's opposite to het torentje in Dutch. And this is the working office of our Prime Minister. But on the other side, you can't see there, is McDonald's. And I always say in our strategic advice needs on the one hand a definite link, a room with a view to the Cabinet's office, the Prime Minister's office, but on the other hand also a room with a view to society, hands and feet in society. First lesson, it's crucial for scientific-based policy advice to have your hands and feet in society. And that's also we as a council, the members of the council, and please, the next slide, yes, that's me. No, just a slide in between. This is the advisory landscape in the Netherlands. I've included a few sheets for the distribution afterwards so that you are a bit broader informed. But given the very limited time, I'm not going to detail the various advisory bodies in the Netherlands and don't share the details there with you. But this is the broader landscape in the Netherlands of advice, scientific-based advice in the Netherlands for policy making and strategic long-term policy making. As said, this is our building. Hands and feet in society is crucial. Just one final image. This is the council. Not for the very fact of the picture itself, but what I wanted to share with you is all members of the council have a position at university, are based in science with their work, and they share a broad variety of disciplines. That also links with strategic long-term policy advice, because developments in society relate to many, many different domains and thus relevant disciplines, from economics, laws, ethics, to the more beta-based disciplines. So we have both in our staff as well as in the council a broad variety of disciplines. The council, the Dutch council, does not, by definition, works on foresight. What we do, what our prime task is, translate science to policy and translate policy to science. In that, new insights in science are translated into what it means for policy challenges, and problems and challenges in society are, through our work, translated into challenges for policy, and thus what that means for science, or based our answers and our recommendations are based in science. But let me move on to what is the core of my presentation, and that is 4 lessons that I would like to briefly reflect on. What have we learned during our almost 50 years of experience? 4 concrete lessons. First, the topic determines the time frame. Long-term strategic policy advice, a key question there, of course, is how long is long-term? Let me give you two examples. We have currently on our agenda a project on climate change. We look ahead until 2050 and beyond. And the challenge there is to find the right balance between, on the other hand, a broad perspective and enough room for accommodating changes in society, changes in climate and changes in technology. And on the other hand, providing a rigor enough, guaranteed enough framework to base its decisions on. So in here it is the interaction and the challenge to combine on the one hand openness and on the other hand steering. So keep our policy focus as well as stay open for developments is in this project a key challenge given the time frame we set. Another example here is the time frame of our COVID policy making at this moment. The time frame is much shorter in that we look ahead only a few years. And in doing that, we, and as was just also sketched in the previous presentations, we deploy scenarios, possible future stories of possible scenarios for the upcoming years and what that means for policymaking. What is back to normal? What exactly is back to normal within the upcoming years, and what that does mean? What does that mean for society, for regulation, economics, as well as healthcare issues? So, first lesson is in looking ahead, it is crucial to determine how long, how far away in the future are we going to look ahead, because that determines also the mechanism that you deploy, as well as the challenges and the perspectives that you deploy in the advisory work. Next slide. And I have a bit of a problem because I see myself on the slide itself. Different ambitions there. And our way of working and our methodology should match the ambition. So what we've learned is that in looking at our methodology, we should look at our ambition. What do we aim for? Agenda setting, opening up the policy debate, or provide direction? These are three different ambitions, and they all have their own methodology. For example, agenda setting, the future is open, but not empty. Let me give an example of a project report I personally worked on, digital disruption. We do know that at some point in time, society will be struck by a digital disruption or even a digital disaster. So in that respect, the future is not empty, but it is open in the manner as how to react, the values at stake there, and how to relate to these values. In opening up a policy debate, scenarios are a methodology, and in providing direction, I'll give you a link in my next, an example in my next sheet of providing direction, and that is changing the perspective. Illustrative here is our report on food security. The debate in the Netherlands very much focused on agriculture, on farming, on the interaction between farming and agriculture and climate. What we did in this report is change the perspective. Change the perspective in order to have a clear link with the policy of today. So we focused on the long term, but translated the long term back to policy of today by changing the perspective. By changing this perspective from agriculture to food security, and thus being able to provide an insight in the different actors and networks that relate to food and food change, to security, food security. So more than just the implications for climate and the really narrow discussions that are often on the policy agenda. So let me turn to my final lesson, and that is, Professor de Groof, in my introduction, which was a bit uncomfortable given that I didn't hear exactly what you said, what I wanted to say there is long-term strategic policy advice does not mean that we can wait with implementing the lessons that we've learned, that policy making, politics and policy cannot wait because it is, for the very fact it is a long-term strategic issue. Knots, bullets are present-day bullets directed at the longer time. But what we also noted during the past almost 50 years is that it takes time to implement a policy, to implement recommendations, and that when being asked as WRR, are you satisfied with what the government, what politics did with the report? The answer is always, it's difficult to say within the first 3 months. It's even difficult to say within the first 4 years. Let me give you an example of another report I worked on, iGovernment, the electronic government. We published that report in 2011, but we note that only today the government is really working with our recommendations. And that is because both the realization as well as preparation, realization of what the future has in stake, as well as preparations for the future, that takes time. So final lesson is in looking back and in reflecting on our work and the effectiveness of our work, that is not a moment's issue really soon after the presentation of a report. That also requires time. So let me share with you, Professor de Groof, the ambition that in looking ahead, we can look ahead together. Because what we noted during the past few years is that whereas we started at WRR almost 50 years ago with a real narrow national perspective. These past few years we have really noted that for various reasons it's crucial to work together across borders, to learn from each other, to help each other, to inspire each other for our work, because many of the challenges, in particular the challenges that relate to the future, are cross-border, are global. And of course we have our own national approach, our normative frameworks, our national economic position. But even then, lessons from each other are crucial. So thank you also for that very reason for organizing this beautiful and excellent event. Thank you.
Brilliant, as always, Professor Corinne Prins. Thank you so much. May I pay honor and express my gratitude vis-à-vis the commitment of the Dutch Council to include Flemish scientists into thematic approaches from the Dutch Council. You do definitely know that we appreciate your solid inspiration for shaping future policies dealing with foresight and research-based policies. We need definitely the Dutch example to make an excellent proposal to the government and to the parliament on the Flemish Council. Thanks so much. Well, when I selected the best examples, there is an excellent government chief scientific advisor of UK. The model is quite relevant, but we opted for an Irish chief scientific advisor. not just for reason of EU approach, but for the strong commitment of the Irish Scientific Foundation and the Irish Council into foresight policies. And when I talked with Professor Mark Ferguson, who is the chief, this symposium, he definitely was very enthusiastic and very willing to participate by all means. But he's having now a meeting these days with the Prime Minister on, guess what, on COVID-19. And he excuses himself, but we've got a video message. We will have the privilege to hear him from distance. Professor Mark Ferguson is Professor of Life Sciences. He was the youngest professor of Great Britain ever, appointed in Manchester University at the age of 27. Numerous, as Corinne Prince, numerous European Science Prizes. Let us move immediately to the video of Professor Mark Ferguson.
So thank you for the opportunity to talk to you about science advice and foresight and the future. I'm going to divide my remarks really into three broad categories. First of all, the immediate future. Secondly, the long-term future. And then thirdly, the uncertain future, otherwise known as a crisis. So let's begin with the immediate future. So in the immediate future, I think we're quite good at this. I think this is an area where science advice mechanisms and scientific structures can help. So we know that there are current trends that are emerging, things like artificial intelligence, robotics, digitization, the green agenda, the green revolution that's effectively addressing climate action, synthetic biology, future foods such as synthetic meat and so on. These are all things that we know, they're all trends that are growing and accelerating, and they have very significant impact. Artificial intelligence, digitalization, robotics will affect jobs of the future. And that's, of course, an area that many countries, including Ireland, are addressing. And we have a strategy called Future Jobs, and it really looks at the impact of automation, of artificial intelligence, of digitization on the workforce, of robotics and automation on the manufacturing workforce. And like many countries, you can conclude that these new technologies will actually create more jobs than they destroy, but they will massively displace jobs. There will be workers that are currently doing things that will no longer be required, and there will be new jobs and new skills which we have to train people for. And that's important. That's important for predicting the future. If you're going to do educational change, it's usually a long-term game. You have to convince people to change the system, and then it's a few years before you see the output of that system. So that's a really important change. And another really important change that we're going to have to accelerate is retraining people. People who are displaced out of one form of work into another form of work will need perhaps very significant retraining. And that's interesting because many educational systems around the world are not geared up for that. They're geared up in a linear model where you go to school, to university, then you have some continuous on-the-job training with your employer, but you're not really in a situation where you can be radically retrained. And in Ireland, like in many countries, we are rethinking that. Continuing further retraining education is going to become very important for dealing with the immediate future. And of course, COVID-19 has massively accelerated these trends. We knew about artificial intelligence, automation, robotics and so on before COVID, but COVID has just accelerated that with the digitalization, with remote working, with people now doing video conferences and so on. So that trend is accelerating and has been massively accelerated by COVID. So that's an example of the immediate future, reasonably good to get your hands around. Some things are a little more uncertain. I mean, will we have quantum computing and when will that be? Will we have quantum internet? Will there be quantum cybersecurity? But all of those things likely to come. How fast will synthetic biology allow us to address the circular economy and have different forms of manufacturing? When will artificial meat really supplant traditional agriculture? These are issues, but they're predictable issues, and they're in the immediate future, and they really need some attention. All countries, including Ireland, often have a risk register. So in Ireland there is a risk register, and of course that is about managing risks, but it's also about thinking about the future. And if you look at our response, Ireland's response to its risk register, which we update every year, then I think it's a mixed bag. If you look at immediate risks, for example, high on our risk register was Brexit, then we did pretty well. We know that Brexit was going to have a big effect on Ireland and our trading and the movement of people and the land border with Northern Ireland and so on. And a lot of work and planning went in across government and many, many other organisations to prepare well for Brexit. And I think that was by and large successful. But then if you look further down the Irish risk register, number 3 or number 4 is preparing for a pandemic. And there, like many countries, we did very little. So COVID-19 struck, but we really hadn't put in place very significant public health screening measures, test and isolation measures, surveillance measures, and so on. So those all had to be put in place very quickly, even though this was predicted and it was on the register. And then other areas where we're not so good at addressing things is where the problem is chronic or long term. I mean, on the Irish risk register is flooding. Flooding happens every year. It will increase because of climate change. It's partly because of the shape of Ireland. It's almost like a saucer shape, and we get flooding in the Midland areas. And our response to that has not been as good as it could be. So often chronic long-term things like climate action or flooding or so on, they take a longer time to address. So I think it's very useful to think about, the risk register, but more importantly, how do we respond to that risk register? Some countries, for example, the UK, will practice some of the risks, and that's clearly important for a large country. For a smaller country like Ireland, it's important, but perhaps not so important because there are good connections between the people, and we actually understand where the players are and can mobilise quite quickly. Other strategies deployed by countries include foresighting or future prediction or scenario planning exercises. We clearly do that. We read other people's foresight from the World Economic Forum, from various international fora, from meetings such as FIRE, which is the Future in Review, and we think about scenarios for the future. So they are all mechanisms to try to help us adjust our scientific advice for future planning. And that now brings me to the second topic, which is the long-term future. So the longer-term future is much more difficult to get your hands around rather than the immediate future. So where would be good places to go there? Well, scientific funders are often best placed to look at the longer-term future. I mean, the cutting edge of frontiers research at the moment may become tomorrow's applied technology. So looking at where the boundaries, where the frontiers of scientific advances are, often a good way of getting a handle on what might be useful. And in Science Foundation Ireland, we do that. Our strategy is about delivering today and preparing for tomorrow. And preparing for tomorrow is about predicting the future. It's about trying to see what trends will be important, which ones Ireland should respond to, how we can be best placed to do that, either in terms of recruiting or developing researchers and so on. So that's really important, and there are new tools to help us with that. Big data analytic tools from bibliography, from patent searches and so on. And we know, for example, there are algorithms that look at the literature cited in a patent, and if that literature is over a diverse number of fields, but the patent is about a fundamental technology, then it's quite likely to be more impactful than a more narrowly focused patent application. So looking at frontiers of knowledge systematically using detailed bibliometric methods, companies such as Elsevier are prominent in doing this. This is a way of getting a better handle on the longer term future, in addition to things like scenario planning and foresight and almost science fiction ideas. This is going to become more important. I mean, progress is accelerating. The pace of discovery and application is accelerating. There's much more innovation, much more acceleration. And if you look at these trends, they kind of fall into two categories. There are things you need to deal with nationally, and that's important, and they may be things like the examples I've given of Brexit or flooding or the dairy industry that's quite important in Ireland. But then there are international things like global climate change. Are we going to do geoengineering? What's going to be the situation in terms of satellites and space what's going to be the situation in terms of oceans and ocean pollution and plastics. These are all things that require international cooperation, international focus on what's going to happen. And organisations of scientific advisors like the European Science Advisors Forum, ESAF, like INGSA, which is an international organisation, like the European Union mechanisms. I mean, there's been much more global collaboration, partly driven by the pandemic. Regular meetings of chief scientific advisors, often chief medical officers, other technocrats in the system. And that's very good because it can give you a unified response. It's something we need to build on for these global problems such as climate action or climate change. And then the last thing I'll talk about is uncertain futures, otherwise known as a crisis. And they are going to happen. I mean, the future is not completely predictable. Unexpected things will come out of the woodwork, or they'll come out of or expected things will accelerate in unexpected ways. And during a crisis such as the current pandemic, I think science advice has come to the fore. And really important in that is, how you deal with things when it's uncertain. I mean, it's really quite straightforward if there's a body of knowledge and you have to do evidence synthesis and you can write a report and everybody agrees what the evidence is. But that's not the case in a crisis, and it's not the case in an uncertain future. And so in these uncertain futures, I have 6 questions that I always ask. The first is, what do we know? The second is, how and with what confidence do we know it? The third is, what more do we need to know? And the fourth is, how and when can we know it? Brackets, and how much is it going to cost? The fifth is, what should we do and when should we do it? And the last is, how best to communicate this? And those are 6 little questions that I think are very useful when you're coming to look at a crisis. Because you often have to make a decision when there's uncertainty within the system, when the evidence is not there, when there's often very scanty evidence. And it's no use saying we need to do 2 years research until we get the evidence when you need to make a decision in the next day. But equally, if you can get something in a week, that might be helpful. So I think there are really quite important tools for dealing with crises. Another very important tool is international collaboration through the organisations that I mentioned before, such as ESAF and the Science Advisors, so you can learn from different people. And I think that international learning and that very rapid pivoting and being able to change tack when evidence occurs, being clear about uncertainty and communicating that uncertainty and going with best efforts, but being able to change your mind when the evidence arises. Those are all things that have come to the fore during the COVID-19 pandemic. And then lastly, let me say a few words about getting societal buy-in into the future and into future scenarios. So the age of the internet, of social media and so on, has completely changed how people expect to be involved. No longer is it acceptable for distinguished individuals to write a report and to give it to people and say, here you go, this is what you should do. That's really not how today's society operates. With the democratization of science, with the power of the internet and social media, people want to be involved. They want to make their own judgments. So supplying curated information is really important. And that's something as science advisors we need to learn. I mean, it's very easy to put together a group of experts and have an expert report, and generally they kind of agree, or where they disagree is known. But curating information and letting people come to their own conclusions is often very powerful, but much more time consuming and much more difficult to do. And a very good example of that I often quote comes from the United Kingdom, where the late Professor David Mackay, who was the former Chief Scientific Advisor to the UK Department of Energy and Climate Change, as it was known at that time, he put together the UK and then subsequently other countries' energy calculator. He used basic information to look at the power, electricity needs of companies, of domestic users. He looked at power generation through wind and solar and nuclear and coal and oil and gas and so on. And he put all of this together in a series of ways. And then he said to people, you go and see how the UK's future electricity generation system should look. Here are the demands, here are the ways of doing it. And what's really interesting about that exercise and that calculator is that it builds consensus. that people who were coming from very diverse views, like no nuclear or no coal or no oil or no gas or all wind or all solar, actually realized you couldn't do this in many of the extreme scenarios, and the number of realistic opportunities was really quite limited, and it was a consensus building exercise, not by telling people, but by allowing people to arrive at that conclusion themselves. And I think that's a very important lesson for the future. And we in Ireland have built on that in a slightly different way through the use of citizens' assemblies, where people will listen to evidence, they will synthesize that evidence, they will think about scenarios, they will come up with recommendations. And I think much more citizen engagement is going to become important for the future, where people really want to be involved in a kind of different way, rather than having a group of experts write a report and say these are our recommendations. Of course, there will always be a role for that, but I think increasingly knowledge curation, allowing people to make their own decisions, to do their own synthesis in a straightforward way, but not taking extreme biased views, will become important. So I think those are just a few ideas about how scientific advice can contribute to the immediate future, to the more predictable stuff, to the longer term future, which by definition is unpredictable, and by the uncertain future, which will always be with us. We will always have crises. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Professor Ferguson. I will have a phone meeting tomorrow with Mark, where I will get opportunity to express our highest appreciation of the critical capacity and the vision of the Irish Council. Let us move quickly, although it's quite a miracle. We are still following the strict timetable, but let us move quickly to another interesting example, namely the Danish Council for Innovation and Research Policy, headed by Frede Bleiberg, who is Professor of Energy Technology at the Aalborg University. His research concerns chiefly applications of power electronics. For me, as a modest professor of law, it seems very intriguing, but I guess definitely that we will be privileged to listen to your lecture. Yes, please, Professor Bleiberg.
Yeah, thank you. I hope you can hear me. And first of all, thank you very much for the invitation and come here and talk about the Danish R&D system. What we can say is that prediction in general is difficult, especially about the future. I think this was the Danish physics Niels Bohr who said that, but also among others. And what I will do here today at this presentation is just to give you a little insight in how the Danish R&D system is organized, including the universities. And then I will tell you a little about how we do what we can call a kind of foresight in order to initiate different things in the Danish system. And then finally, I'll come with some concluding remarks. I'm not sure whether I have the slides. Let me see. Yeah, here they come. The first thing is about the Danish Council for Research and Innovation Policy. This has been there for fundamentally for much more than 10 years. In the beginning, it was only research, but lastly, 6-7 years ago, there was a change, and the Danish Council for Research became expanded to innovation policy too. And the general thing with this body is that it's totally independent. However, it's nominated by the Ministry of Education and Science. So what we do there, we do it on our own initiative, in our own capacity, and then we give advice, let's say, to the public, and of course to the ministry and the government. So the way we work is continuously to look at what is going on, both in terms of national activities and international activities. And then we pick up different areas which we feel that they are the most important, and we have not covered them before. And then we are making working groups who are studying the different cases and come with, in general, recommendations. We do not have the power, let's say, to put it into, let's say, acts by the Danish ministry, but of course we hope something will happen. And the experience had been so to have such body that the government are listening to what has been proposed, but also the whole ecosystem we have in terms of R&D and innovation policy have had impact. So that's of course interesting to follow. Before I start, let me give you one of the big changes, and I think we are a little bit different compared with many others, and that's something we are also going to look at soon, and that is where we reorganize totally the as a higher education and research institutions in Denmark. There was a new law saying that the whole governance structure should be hired. We would have a board around the universities, and that was a big change. So all people are hired. Let's say the leadership is hired from the board level and down to the department head level. So this was a very big change. But another very big change was that in the past we had 25 research institutions and universities, and the research institutions which were heavily, let's say, related to different ministries, they were merged with the universities. And there was at that time some visions that all the research which was going on in the research institution, they could also, let's say, be used in the education. But also the idea was that let's say the universities became stronger if we merged more research capacity into the universities. So that was a big change. So what come out of it was that after this merge, we have 8 universities left, and we only have 3 research institutions which are totally independent. So this is a big change which we saw many years ago, and I can reflect a little bit that later. But here is then how we are organized in terms of what we call national R&D funding and advisory system. And what you can see up here to the top, we are the Danish Council for Research and Innovation Policy. We give advice. And then we have fundamentally, let's say, 3 strong bodies, the Danish National Research Foundation, the Independent Research Fund Denmark, and then the Innovation Fund Denmark. And the Independent Research Fund Denmark, this is the only one together with us who has, let's say, the fundamental rights, or what should we call it, to give advice for the government as such. And while the 2 others, they have mostly focused on implementing, let's say, large amount of money which are funded by the state budget. And let me then show, let's say, the last about the structure, and this is the view of the total bodies we have, where we can say we have the fundamental research, we have more applied and then we are more into the innovation level. And what you can see here, how this is organized, is that the Innovation Fund Denmark has relatively broad area, and there are a lot of collaboration with companies. We have the Independent Research Fund Denmark, we have the National Research Foundation here, relatively fundamental research. But then we also have actors like the private foundation, which are working, let's say, independent, but of course, according to, let's say, how the money are released from the companies they are representing, or what should we call it, and or the foundation they are. And then we have here for the more commercialized area, we have private venture capital, we have business angels, we have Danish Growth Fund, and then we have here, let's say, different programs which are related to the different ministries, for example, the energy, the climate, food, and so on. And this is the whole spectrum we are trying to give advice to when we are working in our life. If we look in the Danish foresight system, we can say that we have been running now 3 times what we call research catalogs. And research catalogs are looking on which kind of needs there are in the Danish society of research in different areas in order to, let's say, solve problems we have in our daily life. And all the input to those research catalogs, as we say it, they are coming from all kinds of stakeholders, industry, universities, research institutions, all kinds we can imagine who has some interest. And a lot of input is coming there. The Danish Ministry of Education and Research is then trying to gather all things together, also to do some kind of priorities. We are also heard a little bit as the Research Council. And then after this processing, a huge catalog is published. And this is a kind of guideline for the Danish system about what is a good idea to invest in, let's say, more short term. So we can say on one hand, it's a bottom-up research, well, a bottom-up process we have, but on the other hand, when all things have come in, then it's one way or the other are a kind of top-down. But I would say and I have here a link for the slide, you can see that the list, the broadness is relatively wise. So if we should say, let's say, some conclusions about this kind of process, this has been used for prioritizing what we call strategic research for new, let's say, when new money have appeared. So in that way, we have a kind of bottom up for the strategic research. We can say also that as the catalog has been relatively broad, not all have been, let's say, have been funded, but it has been inspiration for the universities, also for other stakeholders, to put more effort into those activities which are listed in this one. And if we look back 15 years back, we can say that it has had a very strong impact of what have been happening in terms of strategic research, but also what has happened at the universities. So this is a process being conducted 3 times now in the Danish system in terms of forecast. Then we have a new, let's say, agenda, where maybe in the past there was more focus on making money, if we can say so, from research to business. But now we are introducing, like the world, like Europe is doing, missions. And there are especially a very high attention about this long-term mission that we want to be carbon neutral in 2050. And to monitor this, we have a Danish climate board, and they have published that we need to do initiatives in different areas. And on last state budget, 4 missions was defined out of this list that the Danish Climate Act was saying. And we are now running what we can call a process to implement the mission-oriented research. And there has been a very interesting process that, and that this is done by the Innovation Fund Denmark, that stakeholders, they have been asked to put together a plan until 2050, as a kind of time plan. What do you need? What will you do in the first year? What will you do in the second year? What will you do in 10 years in order to solve the challenges we are having? So Denmark can come on, let's say, on the right track in order to fulfill the targets of 70% reduction of the greenhouse emission in 2030, and of course carbon neutral in 2050. So this is a very interesting process, and those 4 missions all can, let's say they want to try, and now for the moment they are evaluating who were coming with the best proposal, and then they will be the key persons to implement those missions in the society, but also where it's possible for others to join in if they were not a part of it in the first one. So this is a new experiment, and I'm also very interested to see how others are doing this in terms of implementation. What we are also looking at there in the Danish Council for Research and Innovation Policy is how is the right way to do it, because the missions we have defined, they are very different. And some of them are just straightforward, technology-oriented, while others are extremely dependent on that the society is also prepared or willing to take the lead in order to implement the things we want to do. So we are discussing whether we, like in the past, we had TRL level in terms of what we are proposing. We should maybe also introduce MRL level, as a mission readiness level, in order to come with the right tools in order to do the implementation of the proposal. And then the last thing I would say is that by this merge of the research institutions and the universities, I think we also have a new thing we have to look at, and that is how the government commissioned research is being done in Denmark. And this also both in terms of short-term and long-term, exemplified also with the COVID-19. So my time is over. I hope you got some inspiration about how we are trying to look a little bit into the future, but it's not extremely systematic like maybe we see in other countries. So thank you very much for inviting me in here today.
Thank you so much, Professor. You focused quite clearly, you detailed quite clearly the involvement of your foundation, of your council, to the most important research areas for the future. We highly appreciated your intervention. Apparently, the Scandinavian models are very popular. Let us focus on the Finnish, the so-called Science Advice Initiative of Finland. In the mission statement of SOFI is mentioned building the next generation scientific advisory systems in Finland. This council is headed by Professor Risto Nieminen, who is professor of physics at the Aalto University in Finland. He was granted, among other prizes, the title of Academician of Science in 2014. Again, a quite impressive track record on research and on commitments to the society. Professor, you have immediately the floor.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the invitation. Can I get my slides on, perhaps? Thank you. Yes, I'm a professor at the university and a former president of the Finnish Academy of Science and Letters. And it's an honor for me to have the opportunity to tell you a little bit of our recent experiences in building a science advice mechanism in Finland. Now, science advice is very much in the DNA of honorific academies like the Finnish Academy of Science and Letters. It's written in our constitution, similarly to how it's written by Thomas Jefferson in the constitution of the National Academy of Sciences in the USA, in Royal Society and so on. But during our history, it has mainly been realized through individual members of the Academy rather than thematic effort. So what we decided to do a few years ago is to start an initiative of constituting a next generation science advice system in the country. I'm focusing here my comments on the advice ecosystem. I will not talk about the broader scientific policy foresight system. The ecosystem is obviously very complex. I will focus on what the Academy of Science and Letters wants to do in the area of advising the government, advising the media, advising the general public in scientific matters. That obviously includes the foresight efforts, but it also includes many other issues. At the outset, what I want to say is that we feel it's very important to build an advice system which is independent in the sense that it is not a spokes organ for any special interest group, special scientific area, or whatever. And our feeling is that academies of science, with their multidisciplinary nature, consisting of the acknowledged experts in many areas, are the best vehicles for building a reliable scientific ecosystem. This project, what we call SOPHI, started a little more than 2 years ago, and our mandate is during this project, 3-year project, to create a permanent science advice mechanism in Finland. And I'm very happy to tell you that we have already accomplished this objective. The Academy has made a decision to make this a permanent fixture in their organization, and also absorb the economic responsibilities for keeping and building this mechanism and system. What we aim at is rather broadly described as promoting dialogue between the research community and the decision makers at large. And also want to facilitate further discussions on the future of science advice. So I was specifically asked to tell us some of our experiences during this piloting period of the things that we have been doing, and what are our experiences in doing them so far. And I've chosen the 3 examples which I consider to be a very positive, perhaps even best practices, and where our experience has been rather encouraging. The first one is what I call scientific sparring. And it's a dialogical method targeting system-level policy design through early on facilitated discussions between policymakers and scientists. So we have arranged and generated several sparring sessions, sparring programs, and I've mentioned here 3 example cases. Currently, under construction is a new Nature Conservation Act, and this has been prepared together with the civil service, political leaders, and the scientific community. And we have organized these sparring sessions and found it to be very useful mechanism, system level policy design. And I'm very happy to report that these sparring sessions have also been very well taken by the persons responsible for preparing legislation and also by political leaders. This has been done together with the Ministry of Environment. The second example of scientific sparring is the renewal by the Prime Minister's office of the public sector strategy in the country. And this again has been subject to sparring sessions, mainly between the civil servants in the public, in the Prime Minister's office, and the members of the Academy. Finally, another example is the National Transportation Framework piece of legislation, which is underway in renewing and preparing new legislation for transportation, including cars, trains, and so on. These example cases have several strengths, and they have been found to be very useful in exploring complex topics where clear answers are evasive, especially at this early on stage where facilitated discussions are very useful. Weaknesses, they are not always easy to get started, and my emphasis here is that if you want to have open and direct dialogue in the policymakers and the scientific community, you have to have a very strong baseline of mutual trust. Now, luckily, I believe that in Finland we have a relatively strong position in this sense, and perhaps this partly explains our success in the experience so far. But you need this element of trust in these early on discussions. The second best practice I want to share with you is what we call thematic evidence maps. And these are high quality knowledge evidence synthesis on emerging societal issues, and we have collated them with co-production methodologies. So this is to what has been discussed so far in the area of foresight activities. We have two example cases. One has been concluded and the other one is underway. The first one, which we have now completed and reported, is the digital well-being of especially children and adolescents. And this has been extremely well received by the community and by the society at large. I understand that there is quite a lot of shared worries about too heavy addiction to digital devices and environments, especially among children and adolescents. And we wanted to explore these issues more deeply from the scientific. The other example cases where we are building a thematic evidence map is quantum information and quantum technologies. This is underway, but we already see that the question is not only about technological foresight, but these technologies, when adopted, will have very profound consequences for the society as well. And we have made a special effort in engaging social scientists in the discussions and in building this thematic evidence map. The strength of this mechanism, it's a very streamlined model for scientific working groups, and it's very easy to get very strong stakeholder inclusion. I believe that this goal of immediate or future that was discussed by Mark Ferguson, and we also see that this is something where it's very easy to raise interest and get participation. Weaknesses, they are evidence map building is laborious, and it also requires a full-time, sophisticated, qualified researchers, postdocs, for example, who have the possibility of actually putting things together and making the synthesis. My final words, comments, advice. We have targeted young researchers, and actually they have been very eager also to participate in our activities. Was young researcher, early career researchers, very typically identify participation in the societal discussion as something which is very interesting and useful to them. And so we have organized training sessions, especially targeted for younger scientists on building their capabilities in scientific advice. This is an ongoing effort, and again, our experience has been, and I think it also has deepened the discussions within the scientific community and deepened the dialogue in very important ways. I think this concludes my presentation. Thank you. I'm happy to answer if there are any questions later on.
Thank you so much, Professor. We will remember Sophie as a very relevant touchstone for our future reflections within Flanders, within the Flemish community. Thanks so much. We started with the DG, Director General of the competent agency, relevant agency within the European Commission. And according to the principle of subsidiarity, we will give, at the very end of this roundtable, the floor to national and European platform of academies, namely the so-called ESAF, the European Science Advisors Forum. Again, the mission statement is quite detailed and very interesting, so I'm quite sure that Professor Tarmo Sommere, chairman of ESAF, and also president of the Estonian Academy of Science. I remember very well our phone call, long phone call, and you were so enthusiastic about the idea of having this European conference. You have the final words in this roundtable. Yes, please.
Thank you very much, Professor de Groot. Complementary to the Foresight activities, which have been so nicely highlighted by Stefan Guest, the ability to extract best knowledge from scientists and experts for policy decisions is gradually becoming one of the main pillars of competitiveness of countries, regions, and even continents. The problem is that this knowledge is never spread homogeneously, and neither it is available equally in all countries and regions. And also external conditions, for example, driven by the pandemic discussed today or climate change, They often are altered so rapidly that even the best knowledge could be obsolete in a few weeks, and in some occasions even in a few days. So most countries and regions have developed a system of interfaces between decision makers and accumulated knowledge. It is common to have a robust and well-functioning national system for shaping and implementing policy for science. This means basically a roadmap of how scientific efforts are framed and financed. The complementary link solves the reverse question: how to organize the existing pool of knowledge for the use in both strategic and everyday decision making. And we call commonly this channel or link science for policy. And not many countries or sectors have today the privilege of having such a properly functioning channel. Moreover, in many European countries, the science for policy efforts are actually mixed with other functions or links, and then usually not as effective as they could be. An institutionalized science for policy system, apart from GSR, has been created at the European level, European Commission level, actually only a decade ago. And it's equally important, as mentioned already today, to have a properly functioning and ideally also harmonized with each other ecosystems of science advice also on the country and region level. And to paraphrase one of the past presidents, only then I think we can make Europe great again. European Science Advisors Forum was technically created in 2015 as one piece, one element in the ecosystem of science for policy advice, basically to support, in nice words, evidence-based policy making in Europe. Technically, it's a non-legal entity. Without budget, it's an informal network of European science-based strategic advisors. Every word here is really important. It is an independent entity, as suggested by Professor Estonia, but of course communicates and cooperates with all possible players in the field, including sectorial advice systems. Membership is personal, based on country representation, but members do not formally represent their position in the country. Participation of non-EU but European countries is encouraged, and we have many of them in. Members, one per country or region, have been invited by the European Commission. And the members must follow particular rules. They must be in a formal and active position in their countries. And the position must hold or contain providing advice to their governments. And of course, the advice must be of highest quality, public available, and with a strong national mandate. So these features actually match the message from the group of EU chief science advisors in last summer, and to match the requirement for being trusted, as stressed very strongly by Estonia. The advice must have three properties. It must be public or made public. It must be based on the best knowledge. And third, last but not least, it must come from a body with an absolutely clear mandate. ESAF itself doesn't have any formal advisory task. So it basically provides a platform for different institutions that may function in different systems, but which share a common ambition to provide the very best science-based strategic advice on national level. The goal of ESAF, as mentioned in its terms and reference, is basically nice words, all bureaucratic words, it's to facilitate sharing and exchange of information, expertise, practices, results, etc. It all seems trivial, but we all know that this kind of exchange never comes natural. It needs effort and dedication, and this is what ISAF members are providing. And just to mention that, additionally to climate change or pandemic things, many fields of activity today are actually functioning on a landscape, so to say, of limited resources. And then it's really important to address specifically these fields with great caution. And if possible, then to consolidate relevant knowledge from a larger region and trying to reach consensus with neighbors as an important feature mentioned by Stefan Guest at the beginning. The wider point of having ISAF is a feature, not a bug. It's that the ways of formulations, formats of messages and channels of communication to policy making level are greatly different in different countries and regions. This is not a bug, again, it's a natural feature because of difference in how different countries have built their governance system. So a cornerstone and an important lesson from functioning of ISAF in the last 6 years is that the variety of structures and institutions for such advice across different national governments is of great value in itself. There is no solution that would fit all cases. The COVID pandemic has actually revealed how important flexibility is in the advice system. It is therefore crucial for the development and sustainability and resilience of countries to learn from successful cases of science-based policy recommendation. And it's equally important to discuss together the reasons for failures, and we do sometimes have failures. The Joint Research Centre of the European Commission started a series of workshops under the title Strengthening and Connecting Ecosystems of Science Policy in Europe last year. The goals are pretty much obvious: to map institutions and processes involved, to build a community of professionals, and to try to collectively develop the connection of science to policy ecosystems. This workshop series has two streams, and one focuses on single elements in ecosystems across the European Union, like academies of science. But remember, ISAF is not a constellation of Academy of Sciences. Only 1/3 of countries have Academy of Sciences as their main advice providers, or advices to Parliament or universities or whoever is involved in the system. The other stream addresses single pieces of ecosystems of countries of all regions. And since the 6th workshop in this series in March this year, entitled this time Science for Policymaking in Estonia, some events are organized jointly by the GRC, ISAF and DG Research. And the overall goal of this kind of cooperation is, again, obvious. We really want to synchronize efforts towards best advice at all levels. If I may a little bit say about examples what we have had in Estonia, or experience what we have in Estonia. In Estonia, as in many other countries, the policy for science channel is a robust and well-functioning system. But science for policy is considerably less developed. It's fragmented, and I would say it has mainly a distributed nature. There is no national framing of science for policy advice except for a limited mandate to the Academy of Sciences in its law. A feature, not necessarily a bug, is a mix of science for policy, with other things like lobby for science or science funding decisions, and also policy for science in the country. The success of the system relies on simple features: smallness of the country, like Ireland, and which means very tight personal connections between policymakers and top scientists. Technically, it heavily relies on ad hoc advisory bodies and, of course, direct contacts with leading scientists and experts. During COVID times, a dedicated science advisory committee was formed to provide operational advice. It was very good scientists, but it has one major problem. It didn't really address society, like Korean Prince recommended or mentioned very strongly. So communication of science-based evidence during the first wave of pandemic to society was done in a very strange manner. It was done via a daily newspaper. The newspaper formed a joint academic board with the Academy of Sciences, and this board provided twice a week overview of all new developments and explained their meaning to society. So this kind of very rare example of, saying, hijacking a daily newspaper by academy for the benefit of national science advice could be one of the forerunner towards the future. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. We will make use of the experiences of ESAF and your analysis of strengths and weaknesses of the Estonian case. In non-pandemic times, we should open now the floor for a vivid, a dynamic debate, as we do always, for European and for national conferences and international conferences. But we have to limit this panel now to two short interventions. I don't know if we could get Professor Willy Verstraeten and Saskia van Nuffel on the screen. I don't know if they are present. And voilà, perfect. Well, thank you so much being with us for, unfortunately, just limited time of interventions, and younger generation is always welcome.
Thank you for that.
Yeah, Professor Willy Verstraeten is the chair of the Flemish Research Foundation and a loyal partner in drafting reflection process on the Flemish Council. And he was also appointed as the rapporteur by the government, by the previous Flemish government, on articulating proposals dealing with this Flemish Council. And Saskia van Nuffel is, well, quite active in economic spheres, but also the European digital champion for Belgium. We highly appreciate that you are willing not just to take part in the afternoon session, but also to, well, to express a little bit your first let's say, sentiments and ideas about lessons learned. Professor Verstraeten.
Thank you very much, Chairman. Can you raise your hand if you hear me? Is everything fine? Yeah, thank you. 3 short remarks, shooting from the hip, I will say. First of all, we hear about those beautiful words about foresight, about evidence-based, about autonomy. Then we take our binoculars, and what appears at the end of what do we see then with those binoculars? In that context, we see the scientist. And I'm all for, I'm very much for, but I like to now also stress that scientists are human beings. And if we then bring them in that context of that foresight and that relation to policy making, we must protect them. We must really also bring boundaries around them. We must carefully select them. We must look at their biodiversity in the panels which they make. We must look at a delineation of the tasks and the competences, and we must also make sure that their accountability is well defined. That is my first remark. Science is important. Scientists are very capable to help out in policy making, but there are limitations. We have to keep that always down to earth, or otherwise it might fail pretty soon. My second remark is then the inverse. We are now talking about bringing brains in an organized way together to think transversally. And that's very, very good. I'm all the way for it. But if I then look back into progress of science, and particularly in my disciplines where I have knowledge, I must recognize that very often progress came from lonely visionaries. So we must make sure that besides those organized foresight councils, which we lift up and correctly do so, that we still keep room for what I will call that lonely visionary, that person on its own who must have channels to connect with society, to speak to policymakers, and to also be heard. So I like to bring that second element also in the discussion. And my third element, also very briefly, is generated by the fact that, as Jan prodded so nicely, that the WRR, our Dutch colleagues, are so kind to help Flanders to start with its Foresight Council, for which I like to also express my sincere appreciation for that. But then I took it one step further. Holland, the Dutch group, and also the Finnish, and we learn now today from these European established councils. But suppose I was a scientist now in a third world country, and I am facing in that third world country scientific insights which I have to bring to policymakers, and I'm all alone. So my point is, if we really believe, and I do, in that importance of these foresight councils, which give signals, well-balanced signals to policymakers, we must have also the ambition to, as soon as possible, extend not only from the Netherlands to Flanders, but to extend this in a broader concept of foresight councils, particularly also to developing countries where scientists might need this very much more than we think at this moment. So these are my 3 remarks. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Willy. Excellent. Saskia, your turn.
Well, I will not give it from a scientist corner, because that is not my set of competences. But Jan, let me congratulate you, because I think you've touched on 2 subjects which are critical now. Is not only the future of research and the future of foresight, but also the link with the policy advice. And I often say that in a connected world, every role, every job will change. And what I hear today also from the different presenters is that even the job of a researcher will change. We will get a new role. We will get, I've heard, a next generation. And I think we must pay attention that we do not necessarily ask the new generation of researchers to do it exactly the same way as we did yesterday. The same for the ministers of the future, what I heard. The same for the next generation of policymakers. I appreciate that there is an outlook which is important. The outlook for the future is important. What I missed a little bit is, what did we learn from the last year? Because, you know, managing a crisis is like being a fireman. You can put out a fire, but you also need to take the time to learn from what we didn't do, and not only do research towards the future. So that's just a side remark. What I appreciated a lot was the action driven. So it's one of the intervenants said we need to go to a kind of a mission. We can not only stay at research only. Somebody said we need to define a pragmatic action plan, because we need to go from, for example, was said, from agriculture to food security. I would translate it with my background on technology. We need to go from technology to an inclusive society. and not remain only at the technology itself. We need to go from public sector to what will be the role of public sector tomorrow, from transport to a national transportation framework. So I think research can extend to a more pragmatic link with the action plan. The last part I want to say is we need, the expectations of the citizens have changed because of the fact that already today, and it helps 2020 because we could continue to work and continue to communicate. But the citizens are having informations, correct information, fake news, whatever. But they think they are the better researcher, the better policymaker than the policymaker themselves. They think it. And this makes a little bit the set of expectations from the European citizens or for the citizens in the regions and the countries makes it completely different. And before we had a little bit of siloed activity. There were researchers in their corner doing their research, and then at a certain moment it popped up to the policy, and then we get a set of rules and regulations we need to execute. And I think it's important. One of the persons said one of the challenges we have in Europe is trust. We need to recreate trust. I think if we continue to have a dialogue, if we've done a research and we're discussing, is how can we engage the people to execute on it? And that point is an important one. I'll give an example of something we did in Belgium to close off. I was pretty interested to know how the employment market in Flanders would evolve. Not in Singapore and not in Denmark or not in Spain, but in Flanders. And we did with Agoria, the study of Be the Change, how the employment market will evolve going forward between 2018 and 2030. But the study was not enough. We had the facts, but then we needed to communicate to it. We needed to communicate to the citizens in a language they understand, with preferable positive news. For example, for each job that will disappear in Flanders, 2.7 new jobs will be created. And unlike they say in French, you have to repeat it and repeat it and repeat it and repeat it. And I think we sometimes underestimate the importance of the dialogue, the importance of the communication, and that will help us to really have an engaged population to execute on the conclusions of the research.
Thanks, Saskia. Very powerful. Thanks so much. Let us move quickly now to the very last moments. Can we invite Professor Corinne Prins to take the floor for a few short conclusions? Yes, please. Corinne.
Yes, thank you. Can you put up your thumb? You can understand, hear me? Okay, yeah. Let me turn again to the binoculars that I brought, because I'd like to wrap up the discussion along 4 themes. I think that in the different presentations we have addressed 4 themes, at least headings. First, with the binoculars, what are we looking at? And Mark Ferguson taught us that the future has various divergences behind it. The immediate future, the long-term future, and the uncertain future. So in taking up our binoculars, we're looking at something, but what exactly are we looking at, and how sharp do we have to set our binoculars in looking at the future? And there's also a difference, as Mark Ferguson referred to, between national and international level, and thus the interaction between national and international and the future. That's one heading. What are we looking at? Second heading in what we addressed in the different themes is, I think, what is our tool? What type of binoculars do we have? Mark Ferguson referred to big data. My Danish colleague referred to the catalogs and the research catalogs as a tool. From Finland, we had suggestions as well as regards tools that are constructive and illustrative in the type of binoculars that we used. So that's the second heading, I think, of many of the interventions. A third is, but who then takes up the binocular? Who watches through the binocular? With whom do we deal with long-term science-based advice? Not only scientists, but as has been stressed in many of the interventions, the public as well. It is crucial, as was indicated and stressed in the final important, to execute on it in combination, in dialogue with society, in dialogue with citizens. And citizens' engagement was also stressed in the Finnish presentation. Finally, it is not countries alone. It is the combination of countries, and rightly put by Tarmo Someri, the ASOF example is illustrative there on what we can learn from each other. So I think in using the verrekijker perspective, the verrekijker as a heading for your conference, Jan, you've taken an excellent manner of structuring also the debate along what are we looking at, what tools do we need in looking at the future, scenarios, big data, catalogs, and who is taking up that binocular. It's not only us as the VER or perhaps in Flanders the Future Institute, but it's also society itself, in dialogue with society, in dialogue with science, academics, policymakers. It is our common future. So it's a common challenge. Thank you.
Thank you again, Corinne. You focused quite rightly on the next agenda for debate and reflection on foresight policies and research, role of research in it. Thank you so much. I'm quite sure that we will be happy to co-chair again a physical conference this time in Brussels, why not, in 2022. Thank you so much for your loyalty and for the commitment of the VRR into those efforts on the Flemish frameworks. So no time, we are a little bit, well, we are running out of time. It is not dramatic, but still we have to respect also the program of this afternoon. So it was just amazing. I plan to focus now on the fundamental shift in the dialogue between science and policy due to the sustainability agenda for the future. And quite simple, all international reports dealing with sustainability are stressing the critical tool of science and of research for implementing those SDGs. We will focus and refer to those shift into the next meeting, and we really do hope to meet you again for a physical meeting in early 2022. We will keep you informed. Thanks so much being with us, and we will keep in touch.